From the Honourable Member for Charlottetown Parkdale and the Third Party House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The current seniors housing programme provides subsidised housing for those whose housing needs may have changed or who no longer have the ability to stay in their own home. Eligible applicants must be over 60 or 55 or older with a disability, with eligibility based on need via a rating system that includes income, assets, health, age and present housing circumstances. The date of application does not relate to the position on the priority list, i.e. it is not a first come, first served type of arrangement. A question for the Minister of Family and Human Services. How is priority on that list determined objectively and how are emergency cases handled?
The Honourable Minister of Family and Human Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, anytime I can get to my feet and talk about housing on Prince Edward Island and the housing needs and how this government's committed to making sure that Islanders' housing needs are met, Mr. Speaker. I have actually sat through one of our assessment processes, Mr. Speaker. One of the first things I did was to see how it's done, Mr. Speaker. And I am very happy to stand here and say that just because you've been on there maybe for 6 months or 3 months, if somebody does come in with an emergency and their needs are more than that person who is sitting there first on the list, their needs will be met, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. The Honourable Member, Charlottetown Parkdale, your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A question for the Minister of Family and Human Services. Is the Minister aware that the current list has a 1.5 to 2 year wait time for non-emergency cases and that there are currently over 300 seniors on that list?
The Honourable Minister of Family and Human Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, our staff are in contact with the people, both in the family housing list, Mr. Speaker, and the seniors housing list, almost on a daily basis, Mr. Speaker. So we are very aware of the number of people that are on that wait list, Mr. Speaker, and that is why this government has committed to over $17 million in this budget, Mr. Speaker, that we will implement over the next 2 years, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that Islanders' housing needs are met, Mr. Speaker. And not only now, Mr. Speaker, but with our housing action plan, we will make sure that those needs are met into the future as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. The Honourable Member, Charlottetown Parkdale, your second supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When there's a natural disaster, like the flooding recently in New Brunswick, we implement creative and immediate solutions for the people affected through an emergency measurement plan. A question for the Minister of Family and Human Services. We know that there is a housing strategy and action plan, but given that any new housing arising from that plan will not be available until 2019 at the earliest, and that there is a waiting list now of up to 2 years for community-based housing, what is the emergency management plan for seniors in housing crisis right now?
The Honourable Minister of Family and Human Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the reality is that each and every day, our staff deal with Islanders who are in emergency situations, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to mental health, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to our social programs, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, we are committed to helping them one-on-one, Mr. Speaker. As for housing, if you're not mistaken, in addition to the $17 million, Mr. Speaker, that we have committed over the next 2 years, we have also said that we will create 1,000 new affordable housing units, Mr. Speaker, 275 of those this year alone, Mr. Speaker. So we are aware of the need, Mr. Speaker. We are dealing with Islanders as they present themselves to us, Mr. Speaker, and we are trying to help them navigate in any way we can. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. And the next question will also come from the Honourable Member, Charlottetown Parkdale.
In the newly released Provincial Action Plan for Seniors, there is reference to the higher than average percentage of seniors in PEI, currently at 19.4%, and the expectation that this demographic will only increase over time. There is a priority for developing and implementing home-first age-in-place initiatives, including home, community and long-term services and supports. One of the key areas for investment is accessible housing for people with disabilities and an ageing population so they can remain healthy, happy and safe in their community. Question for the Minister of Family and Human Services. How much of the new housing investment announced in the 2018 budget will be allocated specifically for fully accessible community-based seniors housing?
The Honourable Minister, Family and Human Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, we have a housing action plan, Mr. Speaker. We have engaged community in this conversation, Mr. Speaker. We have engaged seniors in this conversation. We have engaged community partners in this conversation, Mr. Speaker. They are all sitting around the table and are helping government develop our housing action plan, Mr. Speaker, which, as I've said before, will roll out in June, Mr. Speaker. But let's talk about other seniors programs that we have initiated this government. Back in November, we rolled out the Seniors Independence Initiative, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that program is servicing well over 200 islanders right now, Mr. Speaker, allowing them to remain in their homes by helping them with practical needs that they need to stay in their homes, Mr. Speaker. That's just one of the many new programs. We have several across government that help seniors remain in their homes and help them with the needs that they need to stay in their homes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member, Charlottetown Parkdale, your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Provincial Action Plan for Seniors includes 3-year action plan items to promote the health and well-being of island seniors. These include, and I quote, exploring innovative housing options for seniors in the context of Prince Edward Island's Housing Action Plan. As we have a critical shortage of housing right now, what innovative and immediate options has the Minister considered? Emergency funding, temporary housing, or even motels?
The Honourable Minister of Family and Human Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I don't know about the honourable member, but when I speak to seniors in my community and I speak to seniors across Prince Edward Islander, they want to stay in their homes, Mr. Speaker. And we, just in this budget, Mr. Speaker, announced an additional $1 million that we would be investing into our home renovation programs to help seniors that want to stay in their homes, Mr. Speaker. We have also, Mr. Speaker, in addition to the Seniors Independence Program, Mr. Speaker, we have across government implemented many programs that help reduce the costs for seniors, Mr. Speaker, so that they can stay in their homes, in their communities, Mr. Speaker, where they want to be. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Great, Minister, great. And the Honourable Member, Charlottetown Parkdale, your second supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too have spoken to a number of seniors and their families in my district who are truly in crisis. They are ageing and some are disabled, but they are not sick. They want to stay in their community, but they are not homeowners, and they cannot afford market rent. Some families are genuinely afraid that their loved ones will die before they find a safe place to live, and that stress is huge. Minister, we cannot continue to deal with this on a case-by-case basis. What can you and your department do to address this real and immediate crisis?
The Honourable Minister of Family and Human Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. June is a mere one day away, Mr. Speaker. We will have a housing action plan rolling out, Mr. Speaker, within the month, Mr. Speaker. That may answer some of the questions that the honourable member is asking here today. But, Mr. Speaker, let's talk again about the importance of the home renovation program and that $1 million that we are investing, Mr. Speaker. That will take every Islander that applied for that program this year, Mr. Speaker, and that qualifies, Mr. Speaker, they will get their renovation done, Mr. Speaker. And that could mean life or death for some of these seniors who want to stay in their communities, in their homes, Mr. Speaker. That will allow them to do it, whereas they might have had to sell their home, Mr. Speaker, and move on and try to find other accommodations, Mr. Speaker. So to say $1 million into a home renovation program is not dealing with it and cleaning up the backlog of people who have been applying year after year after year, Mr. Speaker, they are now going to be receiving the help that they need and stay in their communities, in their homes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.